Hello, everyone. Good morning. Well, I'm wanted to thank you very much to join us. First of all, my name is Mohammed Amin Dargi. I'm a PhD student at the geomechanic groups, and I want to appreciate from DWS committee to give us this opportunity and about grad students invite the distinguished researcher who admire them. And I want to introduce you Professor Joseph Vantassel, who is a faculty member at Virginia Tech. He earned his bachelor degree in civil engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic of Institute, and he went to the University of Texas at Austin for his graduate study. He's an expert in experimental field measurement, numerical analysis, and central intelligence, and he do very well on geoimaging and in for near the surface of the ground. So, everyone, Professor Vantassel.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Mohammed, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here and for the invitation to come and present about some of the work myself and my team are doing at Virginia Tech. But before I talk about the work we're doing, I just want to point out that I was here at the University of Minnesota in the summer of 2014 when I was an undergraduate student. I did a research experience for undergraduates back when NICE was in existence, and I worked here when I had ideas of becoming a structural engineer before I decided to make the jump to geotech. And we worked in your large-scale structures lab building this partially grouted masonry shear wall. So just a quick aside about that. So it's great to be back and to be back in Minnesota and to have the chance to come and speak. I'm going to try to keep the talk more or less high level and start by introducing geotechnical site characterization, what the problems we're trying to solve by doing imaging are. And then I'll talk a little bit about the work that me and my team are doing and some future directions as we go forward. So let me start by talking a little bit about what are the problems we're facing with geotechnical site characterization. All right. Really, our purpose here is to understand the distribution of engineering properties of the subsurface that we can use in design. And kind of the mental image that I have is this inverted pyramid here, which I divide across 4 different scales. All right, so we're dealing with this multi-scale problem. If we start at the highest scale, this is where we get our geological information. We might reference geologic maps. This is the geologic map here of Blacksburg, where Virginia Tech's located. And the idea here is that it can give us information about the really big picture, right? You're looking at an area of interest much larger than our typical geotechnical site, okay? And this provides very important context for the environments we're working in as a geotechnical engineer. On the other extreme is laboratory testing. And this tends to be the real emphasis of undergraduate curriculum focused on geotechnical laboratory testing because it tells us a lot about how soils behave. The challenge, though, at least in terms of site characterization, is that we're testing relatively small samples. So whereas geology, you might be looking at the 10 to 100 meter scale, in the laboratory, you're really looking at these relatively small samples of soil that you've extracted from the field and putting them through various types of laboratory tests. And I'm showing kind of the classic triaxial cell there on the right. So the question is, what kind of goes in between these? And traditionally, that's been invasive testing. So I'm showing a diagram of the standard penetration split spoon and the cone penetration or cone penetrometer for the cone penetration test over there on the right. And this provides some more understanding of what the in situ behavior of the geomaterials are on that 1 meter to 0.1 meter range. We're still dealing with relatively small spatial area, but at least the in situ tests are giving us a good sense of what's happening with depth. So the question becomes, what fills this gap between geology and invasive testing? One common answer is interpolation. So we're going to do a number of these invasive tests. We're going to push these cones, or we're going to drill these borings at different locations across our site, and we're going to interpolate between them And that's going to give us a pretty good idea of what's going on in terms of our site conditions. But this is not without its challenges. Here's one example of that. Here I'm showing on the right a diagram. We're looking at a cross section. That's my attempt at drawing a tree up there to give you a sense that that's the ground surface. And from our local geology, maybe we know that we have a soft alluvial soil over something stiffer at depth, right? That's what geology is filling in for us. But we don't know exactly where this interface may be, and we don't know exactly what those material properties might be. So what do? Traditionally, we'll drill borings, and these borings are, hundreds of feet apart at some sites, and maybe both of those contact the stiffer bearing layer. So we say, okay, we've seen the soft soil, we see the stiff soil, we can draw a line between these and we can interpolate. And this, at some sites, if they're relatively simple, works well, but not always. For example, if we had an old river channel we weren't aware of that maybe wasn't on the geologic map, we could have variability in between our borings that we didn't know about. So what happens now on the geotechnical project? We have a change of conditions, which means cost of time and money with whoever's trying to construct and build this engineering project. So what I think fills this gap, interpolation has its place, but what I think can also give us a better idea of what's underneath the ground is engineering geophysics. And I think this can give us insights from that 10 centimeter to 100 meter scale to try to fill that gap between what geology can tell us, and then once we can start doing invasive testing, okay? So something I think a lot about in my research is how can we use geophysical methods that were developed in the geophysical community or the petroleum engineering community. How can we use those but apply them to engineering problems and for the very near surface? Top 100 meters or so is generally what we're interested in for geotechnical design. Okay? So how can we best use these tools that already exist and improve them further for the types of problems we as geotechnical engineers are trying to solve? So this sort of sets the stage. And now I want to talk a little bit about some recent progress we've had and some of the future directions me and my team are working towards. Before we go into that, though, I just want to briefly highlight a little bit about my research group and what we work on. We do kind of both sides of the spectrum. We have both experimental work. This is myself in Alaska in January. It was -20 Fahrenheit. And you can see myself here trying very hard to smile in that cold weather. And one of my students here laying out these sensors along the ground surface. This, of course, was done in the summertime, this other photo, which is a much more hospitable environment, without a doubt. So we do a lot of traveling, making measurements in the field, and then we get those measurements and bring them back, and then we do the computational side of things. So using things like high-performance computing, and writing codes to do our data analysis, and more recently, some work with AI, artificial intelligence, and developing better ways to do our processing and our analyses. So with that, I want to kind of highlight 3 of the different areas that we are actively working in and some recent progress in each of these, okay? So we'll start here on the left. And what we're going to be measuring with this method is the fundamental site frequency. So this has a lot of implications, not only for seismic design, but also for just general purpose site characterization. And we'll be using what's called the horizontal to vertical spectral ratio method. What this method involves is taking a sensitive seismometer, burying it in the ground for a period as short as 30 minutes, and we're recording ambient vibrations. So here I'm showing you some ambient recordings, right? It just looks like noise. Those are waves that are traveling in the ground that we can't perceive, but the seismometer, with its sensitivity, can perceive them. And here I'm showing about an hour's worth of data. And with some relatively simple signal processing, we can calculate what's called the horizontal to vertical spectral ratio. So taking basically just the ratio of the spectrum of the horizontal and vertical components. And what's really exciting about this method is that relatively simple processing, if done, and we get a very clear peak, In this case, we can clearly see a peak at about 0.8 hertz. It's been shown that that peak corresponds with the site's fundamental natural frequency, which we can approximate as the shear wave velocity, the average shear wave velocity, so something related to the shear stiffness of our site, divided by 4 times the depth to rock, or the depth of the to where we start getting into stiffer material. So just by making this relatively simple measurement that takes 30 minutes to an hour, we can get a measurement of fundamental site frequency, and we can get a relationship to the relationship between the stiffness of our site to the depth to rock. So what this allows us to do is, if we know we're at a location with a relatively constant stiffness, then if we make measurements of F naught, it's telling us about the depth to rock. And we've gone ahead and we've done this. One of my early projects as a master's student was going down to Wellington, New Zealand. And what we did is, this is their main port in Wellington that was very badly damaged after the 2016 Kaikoura earthquake. And one of the research questions we had was, why did the port of Wellington was so badly damaged, but not the city center? And many of you may know, but Wellington's the capital of New Zealand. So it actually has a lot of importance that the capital wasn't damaged and that government structures weren't affected by this. So one of the things we did, we went around the port and we characterized it using this technique over a period of nights when we weren't going to interfere with some of the rebuilding efforts. And we can see this color-coded map is mapping fundamental site frequency. And you can see in the bottom, we have the darker colors, the darker blue colors. And as we head north up the page, you can start to see that we're heading towards the reds. And because the frequency is getting lower, that means the contrast between the geomaterial and the underlying rock is getting deeper. And we can see that trend continues up to that AA prime line, where suddenly we switch back to much higher frequencies. And so we actually believe what we found is a splay of the Wellington Fault that hadn't been previously mapped, which has huge seismic implications for the stadium and for the port more generally. So an exciting method here to be able to quickly analyze large areas. Some of the work I've done moving forward from that, we have this technique that we can use to measure fundamental site frequency. But one of the challenges with traditional processing, we take our measurements of ambient vibrations here in panel A up in the top left, and there's a series of steps. And I won't go through all the details of what's involved, but it is a highly manual process: manual window rejection, manual resonance identification, manual reprocessing, such that it takes time and it's kind of monotonous and can be a little bit dull to go through and do all this processing to get eventually what we want, which is in the upper right, is measurements of the resonances at our site. And as a PhD student in doing this, I kept wondering if there was a better way, right? Is there a better way than doing all of this in such a manual fashion? And of course, AI is quite the buzzword. So I said, well, maybe AI can do some of this monotonous processing for me and make my life a little bit easier, and maybe I can share that with the world to help others be able to do the same. So I won't go into all the details here, but one thing I will highlight in the top left is the time savings that the AI model, which I call auto HVSR, has been able to provide. So we had about 1,200 measurements, HVSR measurements, that had been made all around the world. Had to first process them manually and then train the machine learning model to be able to do that same process directly. And what's really exciting, we get really good results in terms of the resonance identification and in terms of our statistics on the fundamental frequency and the amplitude of the fundamental frequency, which is great to see. But I want to emphasize the time savings. So traditional processing took 30 hours, so basically a full work week, more or less. But then auto HVSR was able to do this processing in 13 minutes. So you're starting to be able to take things that would take a person who is relatively quick at analyzing these, an expert per se, and you're able to shrink this down so that you're doing hours of processing, tens of hours of processing in minutes. And this is unlocking new opportunities, one of which I'll highlight here, to be able to look at data that hasn't been able to be processed before. So here, just briefly, there are 161 sites in Southern California. We have over 600 HVSR measurements that took years to measure. So some folks had a project. They acquired a bunch of this data over a period of years, and then fortunately they published all that data so that we could then access it, and now we're reprocessing it, and we're able to reprocess that data in hours. And what that's allowing us to do is now start to look at regional scale trends in these types of measurements, like that has not been able to be done before. So it'll be more on what's related to this research coming out hopefully later this year. We just submitted a paper on some of the things that we found. So that was briefly on the horizontal to vertical spectral ratio measurements and making measurements of fundamental site frequency. But one of the things we're interested in as geotechnical engineers is not just the ratio between the stiffness and the depth of rock. We also want to be able to directly measure what that stiffness profile is. And so the next method I'm going to be talking about is developing 1D structural models. So assuming that our subsurface is like a stack of pancakes, we just have one layer directly on top of another, no spatial variability. And we'll be using two techniques, one called MASW and the other one called MAM, M-A-M. And this is a multi-step process, and I'll just briefly walk you through each of them before I talk about some of the things me and my team have been working on. So the first step is acquisition, right? This is where we need to go out to the field and we need to make measurements of surface waves in this case. And we have two different ways we can go about doing this. One is by using active methods where you're actively hitting on the ground with a sledgehammer, or there are other types of active sources that you can use to send those waves into the ground. And then we use lines of receivers. You might be able to see those small blue sensors there to measure that wave as it's propagating across our site. And that's what's shown in the top right there in what's termed a waterfall plot, as the water kind of looks like it's trickling down. The other alternative available to us is passive wave field methods. So here we're going to use a sensor, same sensors as we would use for HVSR measurements, the previous method we were talking about. But now, instead of just deploying a single sensor, we'll be deploying groups of sensors in some two-dimensional arrays. Here I'm showing two nested circles. You can see the pins are devoting the sensors, and then we have our two nested circles here. And in this case, we're measuring ambient vibrations. And you can see an example of that over there on the right. And what's always interesting is it might just look like noise, but then you can start to see these trends, these little pulses of energy that are traveling across our site. And those are surface waves. We can extract those surface waves out of that ambient noise to tell us about what's underneath the ground. This slide is just summarizing that process of taking wave field measurements of those waveforms, in this case, MASW data, active source data. And through some fairly simple mathematics, we can make measurements of how that surface wave propagation is traveling across our site. And what I'm showing there on the right is the experimental data. So here we have a color plot where those red colors are dictating higher energy, and we're able to pick those peaks of higher energy, and those are corresponding to our surface waves propagation at different frequencies. So the waves are traveling at different velocities. That's what's on the vertical axes. And then we can also do this across different frequencies. And then we need to finally, the last step of the surface wave testing process is to take those measurements of these frequency velocity peaks and get our one-dimensional model. And that's the third step related to inversion. So here, I'm now just showing you the peaks here in terms of frequency and surface wave velocity. And the inverse problem we need to solve is to which one-dimensional model. Here I'm showing a schematic of that, where each of the layers of our model are defined by their corresponding thickness and shear stiffness and compressive stiffness and mass density. We need to figure out which combination of these one-dimensional stack of layers has a theoretical solution, which I show in blue on the right-hand panel, that fits the experimental data. So the way this process works, we measure the experimental data, we make some initial assumption about what that model might be, we calculate its theoretical dispersion, and we see if that matches the experimental dispersion we measured. If they match, that's a good indication that this model, this one-dimensional model we chose, is probably a good model. But of course, we're never perfect on the first go around, so we repeat this. And we repeat this tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions of times, depending on how complex this experimental data is. Just add a little note here, this is by far the most challenging aspect of surface wave testing. So it's been shown that groups of analysts will acquire the same data in the field, they'll do the same processing, they'll get the same measure here, but this, the actual inverting it to get the one-dimensional model, you can give different people the same data and they'll get wildly different models sometimes, okay? And so there's a lot of challenges here and a lot of interesting things to come out of this. One of the things that focused of my PhD research was on the quantification of uncertainty in the experimental data and through the inverse problem. So what I'm showing you here, we deployed a grid of sensors and for a different project actually. And so I'm reusing the data here by taking subsets of that data. And so these different colored shapes, some linear arrays, some circular arrays, along this site, which is roughly 65 by 65 meters. And I'm taking each of those different arrays across our site and then processing them all and then quantifying the associated uncertainty on that experimental data. And this is both uncertainty in the actual field measurements, field error, and things like that are baked in, but also because we have spatially distributed measurements across our site, this also incorporates spatial variability, right? And we can see that through the different colors and how they tend to be biased high or low compared to the mean. So this was one process, was how do we quantify, how do we combine and quantify the experimental uncertainty? And then something I'm really excited about was how do we take this quantified experimental uncertainty where we have the mean and standard deviation effectively at these different frequencies, and how do we map that uncertainty to our resulting one-dimensional profile? So this is a process which we termed uncertainty consistent surface wave inversion, in that the resulting profiles, which I'm showing you here on the right, can be shown rigorously to be consistent with the experimental uncertainty in the original data. So this is mapping both experimental error as well as spatial variability into our resulting one-dimensional profiles. And you can see on the right, I'm showing both shear wave velocity, which is related to shear stiffness, Vs on the left panel there, and then compression stiffness or compression wave velocity, which is associated with our bulk modulus of our site. And it's been known that bulk modulus and VP are not very sensitive in terms of surface wave propagation. We're mainly sensing shear stiffness and shear structure. And you can see that play out in the amount of uncertainty we're able to quantify. But what is exciting to see is that the way the uncertainty is increasing with depth, which is what we would expect. And then also to see that even though there's quite a bit of uncertainty here, which is kind of being mirrored by the relatively large uncertainty we had in the experimental data itself, this is largely in part because we didn't originally intend to do this study with this data, but it was kind of a low-hanging fruit. And so we were using sensors that weren't quite what we would typically use. So we get some larger amount of uncertainty in the lower frequency range, which then gets mapped to higher uncertainty at deeper depth. But it is interesting to see that the median prediction, which is shown in the solid black line, kind of cutting through that large cloud of answers, follows remarkably some in situ measurements that were made, in this case using the downhole seismic method. And so we're able to see consistencies in the median prediction, and what we're actually able to capture then is this spatial variability across the site. So exciting things there. And one implication of this in terms of being able to quantify that uncertainty is when you want to go ahead and do time-lapse monitoring, right? And so one of the reasons we were in Alaska was to do some of this time-lapse monitoring by deploying these arrays, in this case, very short arrays, to be able to look at the depth to ice-bonded soil. And you can see some of the velocity models we'll be publishing later this year from the measurements that we were able to make there. All right, the last topic I want to talk about is now going towards 2D and 3-dimensional imaging using an approach called full waveform inversion. So the big picture here is just kind of as I showed you on that earlier slide, we might have from local geology a sense of that it's some soil over some rock or some stiffer material, but we don't know exactly where that interface is. And full waveform inversion gives us a way to try to quantify this in 2D and 3D. So we go to the field, we deploy sensors. Here I'm showing with blue triangles. Again, I'm showing that photo of that linear array of receivers. We then hit on the ground, usually in the center of the array this time. You see me swinging the hammer right there. And what we measure at each of those sensors is giving us information about the subsurface structure. So you see the time distance plot we have there. You can see the two waves are spreading out, and we can see some later reflections and refractions coming back up to the surface. You can see some of that energy getting sent back up to the surface. The idea behind full waveform inversion is once we've acquired this data, we can then solve its corresponding inverse problem to try to capture, in this case, what the two-dimensional structure must be and where that soil and rock interface should be and how it generally looks. And this, of course, is showing you a very idealized situation. And just like with surface wave testing, the inverse problem is the most challenging aspect. So how do we recover this two-dimensional image of the subsurface from those experimental measurements on the right? So when I was first getting interested in full waveform inversion, I started by looking at how it would apply to near surface structure. So I created this synthetic data set where I have some sensors and receivers and have different source information getting sent into the model. And I just wanted to look at a typical geotechnical case, which is soil over rock. Okay, and so here we're looking at shear stiffness, the shear wave velocity here of a soil over rock. And we can see this kind of generally concave down shape, and there's some undulations to the interface here. So starting with traditional approaches, all the traditional approaches need a starting model, an initial guess of what's underneath the ground. And a very common initial guess is that we use a linear model. So we just assume that across our two-dimensional slice, that the stiffness of our site is just increasing linearly. And if we go ahead and start with that initial linear guess, and then do the inverse problem where we're iteratively modifying that initial guess, this is the result we get. Okay? So you can see that it's modified itself somewhat from a linear model. We can see that there's maybe a little bit of a hump near the center, which kind of corresponds to the hump here at around 30 meters. Something's going on. And you can see that here we're able to match the experimental data. It might be hard to see on the screen, but there's actually a green line plotted on top of a black line there. So we're getting good match in terms of the waveforms, which would imply that that model must be a reasonable model. But we didn't want to just look at a linear model. We also wanted to say, well, we do these one-dimensional techniques like MASW. What did those result in if we start with those as an initial starting model? And so we repeated this inversion process, but we started with a different starting model. Now we're starting from something with MASW, which tends to have a lot sharper breaks. And you can see that again, we get something kind of resembling a hump at about 30 meters, and we get a match to the experimental waveforms. But while the waveforms agree well, those rightmost figures there, neither of them exactly match this true model, right? There's very, at least in terms of geotechnical engineering, there's big difference if the rock looks like this with no variability at all and a very sharp contrast, versus the upper model where things are gradually changing and there are spatial variability. In terms of a geotechnical engineer's perspective, these are wildly different answers. Okay? So we see that there is this sensitivity to the initial starting model, this initial starting guess. So when we're thinking about being able to do this on a geotechnical project where we might go out and do this first before we have any other information about our site besides geology, this becomes really challenging. How do you get a good starting guess when the whole reason you're trying to do this method is to understand what's underneath the ground? So thinking about this, my idea was maybe AI, machine learning, can provide an initial starting guess for us, right? It should be at least as good as my initial guess if I'm just guessing. Maybe AI can do a little bit better. And so here again, we have our true model here on the left, and on the right, we're showing what our deep learning model was able to predict, our convolutional neural network model there on the right. And what's interesting is that this pure machine learning based approach is outperforming these traditional techniques. And my initial inclination was, well, the AI should get us something, but we're definitely still going to need to optimize it. It's not going to be perfect, right? It's an approximation. And so we then repeated the whole process of then trying to begin with the AI's prediction and try to improve on it. And we were actually finding that the traditional optimization approaches couldn't improve upon the initial AI guess, which kind of starts to make you wonder about the possibilities that are there for AI-based imaging. And I would say the other advantage that's quite exciting is how quickly the AI model can make its prediction, right? Essentially, as soon as you acquire the data, you can put it into the trained model. Now, training the model takes time. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, but you can do that all up front. So you can have this fully trained model. You can go to the field, acquire data, drop the data into the model, and literally within seconds, have a prediction of what's underneath the ground, which if we're thinking about the future and how we might be able to utilize this in practice, it's really exciting. One limitation, though, of this work was that we were focused on soil over rock, right? We just wanted to start with a relatively straightforward geotechnical problem. And one of my students, my PhD student now, has been working on expanding this work to all sorts of variable subsurface conditions. So he's developed a geostatistical framework to be able to generate subsurface models at varying levels of complexity, starting from things that are rather simple, for example, up in panel A, where it's more or less homogeneous, to something that's highly interlayered and has a very complex structure, and then developing the AI model using these more complex subsurface models and making those predictions over here on the right. And based on the preliminary results that we have, we're looking to publish the paper later this year, is that AI is predicting our shear wave velocity, our shear stiffness within about 20%, which is more than enough for us as geotechnical engineers to differentiate a void from sand, from rock to more like a gravel. We can differentiate these types of materials, even though it's only within 20% accuracy. So we're actually quite excited about being able to predict shear wave velocity within 20%. And you can see some of the similarities here between the panels on the left and right and the corresponding errors that we were getting. Obviously, the simpler the model, the lower the error. The AI is able to do a better job. And when you start to get to really complex layering, which starts to push the bounds of what's probably geologically feasible, the error, of course, goes up. But exciting things here as well. The last thing I want to mention is some of our work to go towards 3D. So up to this point, we've been focusing a lot on two-dimensional imaging, and this was a data set we acquired back in 2019. But we just got around to organizing it and actually making it publicly available. And we published a data paper last year that explains all the experimental data that we have available at this site, and with the aims of developing three-dimensional model out there using some of these new techniques. So more on this in the future. And so with that, I will, of course, acknowledge financial support from National Science Foundation, which sponsored the vast majority of my PhD research, as well as the computational support, right? A lot of our work is experimental, but also a large chunk of it is computational. So computational support from the Design Safe Cyber Infrastructure, the Texas Advanced Computing Center, and most recently, the Advanced Research Computing at Virginia Tech. We've been utilizing their systems a lot in the last year. So with that, I'll put up this summary slide. I don't feel the need to necessarily read it to you all, but maybe it'll prompt some questions with the time we have remaining. I did want to put a photo here for some visual interest of the Northern Lights, the aurora in Alaska from this past January. So with that, I'll conclude the talk and welcome any questions.
Hello. You feed the AI the waveforms and it spits out the model in a matter of seconds.
Yes.
That's scary.
Yeah.
Is it one component or three component?
The data right now is only one component.
Just a vertical?
Yeah. Yeah. I have another student starting that will be looking at using other components because that gives us so much more information. Having both vertical and horizontal or a three component even, I think has a lot of exciting potential.
And last question for now. So this is a 2D.
Yes.
What about off-profile variation? Because you're going to have diffractions, reflections coming off, and that's going to be mapped into the model. Have you looked at how that might affect?
That's another point of interest. I'm right there with you that this is making the assumption that it's plane strain, right? That things are kind of staying constant in that dimension. And we know that's not the case, right? If we see this much variability in this plane, we're fooling ourselves if we think that variability is not also in the other plane. So I would say an exciting area for future work. Not something we've been able to address directly just yet. But as we get further into three-dimensional imaging, and I think this motivates the idea of three-dimensional imaging, we're going to have such a hard time if we just stick with 2D. 2D is nice because that's generally geotechnical engineers. We like to look at 2D. That's what we're used to looking at. But the reality is that it's 3D, and that variability is there, and we need to be able to have a way of quantifying it. So I'm right there with you.
Okay, and last question. To train the neural network, you just generate a ton of full waveform simulations for different models.
Exactly right. So for this particular data that I was showing, the third to last slide or something like that, it was 100,000 different two-dimensional models and the corresponding 100,000 wave propagations. And so when I said we were using Virginia Tech's advanced research computing, we were using a lot of it, and that was really fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thanks a lot for the interesting talk. The first question, when you had you showed that frequency and the relation with the depth. So is it theory-based or experimental?
Yeah, so that very simple relationship is the quarter wavelength approximation. So it's approximating the response of the system as if it could be modeled as a fundamental, a very simplified system. We can do more advanced modeling where we actually model the upgoing and downgoing wave propagation and measure fundamental frequency that way as well. But we find oftentimes for geotechnical problems, especially those with soil over rock or something soft over stiff, the quarter wavelength gives us a good approximation to within geotechnical.
Does it also refer to ductile behavior? When it goes down, you have more pressure and you will have more ductile, so higher frequency. Does it refer to that or
Can you repeat the first part of the question?
Brittle to ductile behavior when you go down when you have more pressure from brittle, you go to more ductile.
No, I don't believe so. Yeah, this is all assuming that it's an elastic response.
Yeah, I see.
So we're not taking into any non-linearities or stress dependence with that very simple approximation.
And the frequency that you showed is the one that is the range that you wanted to get, or it was the only thing that you got? So which one? You showed the frequency in the figures. So the frequency was not very high. So was it the range that your equipments were able to get it, or it was the one that you wanted to have?
Going regards to the HVSR processing, the lower frequency there. Yeah, so that's more related to the structure of the site. So if the site is deeper or softer, tend to have a lower frequency response. can think of like a structure, right? We kind of have a sense for structure. If they're kind of wobbly, they'll have a lower frequency response. And then if it's stiffer, you will tend to get a higher frequency response. And what that method is doing is allowing us to quantify what that frequency, that resonant frequency is that we're seeing.
Thank you a lot.
Thank you.
They ask, what is the source of the VS profile to transfer to depths from VHSR?
Sorry?
What is the source of VS profile, via velocity to transfer the depths from the VHSR?
So I think the question is, if I understand it correctly, what's the relationship between HVSR and the stiffness of the site profile? So, or shear wave velocity, I think is what the question was asking. So what's the relationship between shear wave velocity and the fundamental frequency? And this, I guess, goes back a little bit to the previous question, that if the site is soft and tends to be very deep, we'll get a lower frequency. So that would mean if we have a lower shear wave velocity in our structure, we get a lower frequency response. And if we have a stiffer site, you know, something that's maybe gravel instead of sand, we would get a higher frequency response. And so we can understand the relationship between the stiffness, the effective stiffness of our site from the fundamental site frequency measurement. I will say that there has been some work done to try to invert HVSR to measure shear wave velocity with depth. There's a number of different competing theories as to what's causing HVSR. So one of my challenges with inverting HVSR to measure shear wave velocity is it's highly dependent on which of the theoretical backings you support, and that controls your resulting model. And because there hasn't been consensus in the community yet about which of these models is correct, you're always left questioning, okay, you chose method A, there are 4 methods. You could have also chosen method C, and you could have gotten a very different shear wave velocity profile. So when I'm thinking about engineering for a critical structure, I'm a bit apprehensive to support doing that until the community decides which of these theoretical frameworks is best supported by the data.
And the second question is, someone asked, I have kind of overlapping between shear wave velocity and the one from MASW, which is related to Rayleigh and Love waves. Both are the same or not?
Yes, so we can use the surface wave propagation. So the surface waves, both Rayleigh waves and Love waves, as they travel through the site, those are sensitive to the underlying elastic material properties, right? Shear stiffness and compressive stiffness or bulk stiffness. And the shear wave velocity we're measuring is a fundamental property of the material. And the way we get to it is by making measurements of the surface wave velocities. So we measure the surface wave velocities, then we go through that inversion process to get that more fundamental property, which is the shear wave velocity. Please.
Yeah, so you showed whacking something with a sledgehammer.
Yes.
I mean, have you thought about using more controlled sources, and do you do this in different locations and then?
Yes. So there's been a fair amount of work with controlled sources. So doing my master's and PhD at the University of Texas, of course, has the NERI Center there from Professor Stokey and his crew, having the vibro-sized trucks that can put in a very controlled sinusoidal source, which of course are fantastic for doing these types of measurements, but they're really expensive to mobilize. So that kind of motivates some of the work with the sledgehammer. And the way we like to try to get to lower frequencies and look deeper is by using passive wave field energy. So that's some of the thoughts, but absolutely you could use a vibro-sized source, highly controlled input, and that would also provide a really great source of information.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was very informative. Thank you very much for attending.